Danita Stokes, president of HAG.
It's bad enough that Sega Genesis has the most 16-bit games.
There was once a time in this industry when, if you were launching a game console, you needed a mascot. Not a logo, not a brand identity, a character. Someone you could slap on the box and say, this is what our console is. That practice largely died out around the turn of the millennium. Platformers fell out of fashion, open-world sandboxes and gritty shooters took over, and the idea of a single cartoon character representing an entire console started to feel quaint. These days, Nintendo is pretty much the only company still pulling it off. But throughout the 90s, mascot platformers were console sellers. The Super Nintendo and N64 both launched with Mario games that became some of their best-selling titles. The Sega Genesis was practically built on Sonic the Hedgehog, and the absence of a mainline Sonic game on the Saturn is still cited as one of the reasons that console struggled. In hindsight, the connection between mascots and hardware success might have been coincidence, but at the time, it felt obvious. If you wanted a hit console, you needed a hit character. And Sony learned that lesson very quickly. The PlayStation launched at the end of 1994, and largely driven by a desire to get sweet revenge on Nintendo, Sony naturally felt it necessary to have a mascot to represent the face of their new console. But it took them a few tries before they'd hit their mark. Their first attempt came in 1995 with the debut of Polygon Man, a disembodied head made of sharp purple shapes that Sony used heavily in the console's early marketing. He wouldn't last long, however, thanks to poor public reception. Now, the idea of basing a mascot around polygons was clever on paper. After all, the PlayStation's 3D polygon-pushing power was a potent selling point early on. But in practice, Polygon Man was just unsettling. He displayed no real emotion, had no personality to latch onto, and did absolutely nothing to communicate what the PlayStation was to the average consumer. Basically, the exact opposite of what a console mascot is supposed to do. Thankfully, Sony came to their senses pretty quickly and retired him later that year, temporarily replacing him with Sophia from Battle Arena Toshinden while they explored other options. And in 1996, Sony would finally land on their honest-to-God mascot with the release of Crash Bandicoot. Sony had teamed up with Universal Interactive, a branch of Universal Pictures founded in 1994 to leverage the studio's IPs and expand into video games. And together they contracted Naughty Dog to create a mascot platformer for the PlayStation, one of the first to be entirely exclusive to the console. The game was a hit, and no small part of that success was thanks to Crash himself. Sony went all in on him almost immediately, pushing Crash as the PlayStation's spokesperson through a series of TV ads starring a sports mascot-esque version of the character, which themselves felt like a direct spoof of the already absurd Jack-in-the-Box commercials of the time. Crash was everything Sony had been looking for. A bold, easily recognizable design, flexible enough to be dropped into basically any situation, with a personality that balanced irreverence and rebelliousness with just enough charm to stay likable. Most importantly, Crash had broad mass market appeal, hitting both kids and teens right where Sony wanted them. And if that all sounds a little familiar, well, you're not the only one who noticed. If anyone ever doubts the sheer ripple effect Sonic the Hedgehog had on video games throughout the 90s, they need look no further than Crash Bandicoot. Alongside characters like Bubsy and Gex, Crash was yet another entry in the snarky, rebellious animal mascot lineage popularized by the Blue Blur, and few were quite as brazen about it as Crash. This wasn't accidental. Internally, the dev team jokingly referred to the game as Sonic's Ass, a nod to the fact that a behind-the-back platformer meant you'd be staring at your character's rear end the entire time. And I somehow doubt the choice of Sonic's name in that joke was arbitrary. Crash Bandicoot wore its inspirations proudly, for better or for worse. I've alluded to my feelings on Crash in a few prior videos, but I've avoided digging into them too deeply because, frankly, I try to stay mostly positive on this channel. But yeah, I'll just say it now, I've never much cared for Crash Bandicoot. I loved mascot platformers as a kid, and I gave all 3 games in the original trilogy a fair shot, but my playthroughs always fizzled out somewhere before the halfway point. No matter how much praise the series got around me, I just couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't doing anything I hadn't already seen done better elsewhere. The only real difference was that this one was in 3D, kind of. And looking back at old reviews, I was honestly relieved to find that I wasn't completely alone in that assessment. While the game's reviewed well overall, there were critics at the time who felt they were simply too derivative. They combined Sonic's sassy animal protagonist with Looney Tunes-style slapstick comedy, and then wrapped it all in environments and aesthetics that felt lifted straight out of Donkey Kong Country. In my humble opinion, the result was something that felt painfully unoriginal. What's more, the games barely did anything interesting with their 3D perspective. Living up to that Sonic's ass nickname, the early Crash titles are essentially 2D side-scrollers with the camera swiveled 45 degrees. Yes, there's some three-dimensional movement, but the levels themselves are still mostly tight, linear corridors, and at times the games drop the pretense entirely and just become straight-up side-scrollers. So not only did Crash Bandicoot feel creatively safe, it also wasn't particularly adventurous from a design standpoint. To me, Crash often feels like a game conceived in a boardroom rather than a studio. Sony and Universal looked at what was popular in Mascot platformers, turned to Naughty Dog, and said, just make that.
Excuse me. You are so totally whipped.
Crash Bandicoot was Sony's first answer to Nintendo, a response to the Donkey Kong Country era of platformers. But the problem with answering Nintendo is that Nintendo doesn't stand still. Because in the very same year Crash debuted, Nintendo released Super Mario 64. And almost overnight, the rules of platforming changed. The Donkey Kong Country school of game design became obsolete. Out went straightforward linear A to B progression, in came open-ended free-form sandboxes where players could pick and choose which objectives, and even which levels, they wanted to engage with. As that generation's console war continued to escalate, Sony knew they couldn't sit still forever. Nintendo was no longer playing catch-up. They were poised to close the gap. Sony and Universal would soon partner again on another Mascot platformer, this time with up-and-coming developer Insomniac Games. The three had previously collaborated on Disruptor, a Doom-style first-person shooter. It was Insomniac's first ever title, and while sales were disappointing, it was received well critically. When Insomniac was brought onto Sony's next project, Craig Stitt pitched the idea of a game about dragons, an idea Sony and Universal immediately latched onto. Early plans for the project were wildly ambitious. The game was originally envisioned as a dark, dramatic epic following the life of a single dragon across several millennia, charting the rise and fall of entire civilizations, including the American Confederacy, believe it or not, before eventually culminating in a full-blown alien invasion in the far future. That version of the game didn't last long. Mark Cerny, the head of Universal Interactive, stepped in and redirected the project. Cerny believed one of the reasons Disruptor struggled commercially was the PlayStation's oversaturation of dark, gritty games, and he encouraged the team to pursue something with broader, more mass-market appeal, closer in spirit to Crash Bandicoot. And so the project pivoted into an open-world 3D platformer, clearly inspired by Super Mario 64, starring a young dragon who could jump and glide across wide, exploratory landscapes. The character was designed by Charles Zimbillis, the same artist behind Crash, a collaboration likely born of convenience given that Insomniac and Naughty Dog's studios were literally across the hall from each other. The dragon was initially planned to be green but was changed to purple to ensure he always stood out against the game's environments. During early development, he went by the working name Pete, then becoming Pyro, until Craig Stitt suggested adding the letter S. And just like that, the world was introduced to Spyro the Dragon. Spyro the Dragon takes place in, shockingly enough, the world of dragons, which is divided into 5 distinct realms, each devoted to a different facet of dragon society. The magic crafters are alchemists, inventing spells to improve everyday life. The Beastmakers create the wildlife that populates the realms. The Dreamweavers oversee the world of dreams. The Peacekeepers are warriors tasked with defending all realms from outside threats. And the Artisans are responsible for the land's arts and culture. One day during a live television interview, the Elder Dragons began talking shit about a notorious troublemaker known as Nasty Nork, a cross between a gnome and an orc, who had been banished to a remote island years earlier. Nasty, watching the broadcast and clearly possessing incredibly thin skin, retaliates by casting a spell that encases every dragon in crystal, freezing them in place. Somehow a young dragon named Spyro is the only one who avoids the spell, and he sets out to free the Elders and put a stop to Nasty once and for all. If Crash Bandicoot was a product of the Donkey Kong Country era of platformers, then Spyro the Dragon is a very clear response to Super Mario 64. Where Crash's levels are tight linear corridors, Spyro's are wide and open-ended, placing exploration above raw challenge. Spyro's moveset is simple but flexible: Flame Breath, a forward horn charge, and a jump and glide combo that lets him cover huge distances. Because Spyro is still young, he can't truly fly, outside of specific bonus stages, so his aerial movement is limited, but reach a high enough point, and he can sometimes cross an entire level in a single glide. What initially seemed like a problem for the level designers quickly became a strength. Rather than restricting the player, Insomniac embraced it, building massive spaces filled with tall walls, ledges, and pillars that act as natural glide barriers. This also enabled some wonderfully unorthodox level design. In Ice Cavern, for example, you can follow the intended path from start to finish, or you can glide from the very beginning to a hidden ledge with some 1-ups, landing you near the end of the stage, and then traverse the whole thing completely backwards. Another major way Spyro distinguishes itself, and one where I think it clearly diverges from Mario 64, is combat, or more accurately, enemy interaction. Nasty's minions aren't just passive obstacles. Each enemy type uses specific forms of attack and defense that force the player to choose between charging or flaming depending on the situation. Armored enemies can't be flamed, bulky enemies can't be charged, and some enemies are both, requiring the use of the environment or temporary power-ups to defeat them. Where there are some instances of this in Super Mario 64, most enemies can be bested by simply jumping over them and letting gravity do the work. The enemy variety is also genuinely impressive. Nearly every level introduces an entirely new cast of monsters, and they're bursting with personality, reacting to Spyro's presence in unique ways. In Ice Cavern, Norks on skis will skid into range before pelting you with snowballs. In Misty Bog, hungry Norks have set traps for the local chickens, and will largely ignore you as long as you don't disrupt their dinner plans. Mischievous druids in high caves will try to sabotage your jumps by manipulating platforms, only to then immediately panic once you slip past their trap. All of this goes a long way toward making the world feel alive. In the opening hub world, the Artisan's Realm, none of the enemies will attack you at all, instead fleeing or cowering when Spyro approaches. Combined with the fact that there are no bottomless pits in the Artisan's home, it makes the area a perfect training ground, a low-stakes space to learn Spyro's movement and get comfortable with the controls before the game starts asking more of you. In that sense, Spyro the Dragon stands as one of the earliest and clearest PlayStation-era responses to Super Mario 64, a game that embraces open-ended 3D spaces, but reframes them around exploration, enemy interaction, and environmental personality, rather than strict platforming mastery. Viewed in context, Spyro isn't chasing Mario 64, it's answering it, translating Nintendo's open-ended design philosophy into something that feels distinctly PlayStation in tone and intent. Structurally, Spyro the Dragon is a collectathon. Each hub world contains 3 standard levels to explore, a boss level, and a bonus flight stage. Beyond freeing the crystallized dragons, every level is also packed with gems, anywhere from 100 to 500, which can be found out in the open, hidden inside breakable chests, or carried by Nasty's minions. Some levels also feature speedy thieves, stealing dragon eggs, which Spyro must chase down. Progression between realms is handled by balloonists, one in each world, who will only transport Spyro onward once he's collected a certain number of dragons, gems, or eggs. Complete the balloonist's requirements in the first 5 realms, and you're taken to the 6th, Nasty's world, where you simply need to clear 2 more stages before finally facing the Big Nork himself. Collectathons in the late 90s had a bit of a reputation for being tedious, with Donkey Kong 64 being perhaps the most infamous example. But I've always felt Spyro was one of the exceptions, and a big part of that is how generous it is with progression. Like Super Mario 64, the minimum requirements for moving forward are relatively low compared to the total number of collectibles available. Much like how gathering every star in the early levels of Mario 64 will mean you can bypass the castle's upper floors, here in Spyro, if you're thorough in the first 2 or 3 realms, you can completely skip the 4th and 5th entirely. Hell, even the bosses are optional, except for Nasty himself, of course. Going for 100% completion only unlocks 1 extra level, essentially a small bonus for players who want just a little more time with the game. If all you want is to see the credits roll, you won't feel punished or left out for taking the more casual route. It also helps that Spyro makes collecting gems remarkably painless, largely thanks to the dragon's steadfast companion, Sparx the Dragonfly. Rather than forcing the player to precisely perfectly line up Spyro over every single gem, Sparx will automatically retrieve nearby ones as long as you get close enough. And if you charge through a chest and keep moving, the gems inside are collected automatically without any need to double back after they hit the ground. Sparx also doubles as Spyro's health indicator. As Spyro takes damage, Sparx changes color from gold to blue to green, indicating how many hits you have left. Take a hit while Sparx is green, and he disappears entirely, leaving Spyro defenseless. and perhaps even worse, forcing you to manually pick up gems. Because of this, Sparx's absence is felt immediately, even outside of the general terror of being on your last hit point. Sparx can be restored by locating and hunting harmless fodder scattered throughout each level, which produce butterflies for him to eat. This all results in a remarkably intuitive and yet forgiving hit point system. Just about the only thing in the game that can kill you immediately are bottomless pits. Spyro can recover from otherwise lethal water hazards if you manage to reach land before Sparx disappears. It's a genuinely elegant bit of game design, serving as both an in-world health system and a way to streamline collecting, all without cluttering the screen with a traditional HUD. That sort of design carries over to the trapped dragons themselves. Each dragon pedestal acts as both a temporary checkpoint and, if needed, a permanent save point, meaning that as long as you're diligent about freeing dragons, you're rarely forced to replay large chunks of a level. If there is one real knock against the game's collecting systems, it's really just the same that could be said of most Collectathon games back then. There's no way to track which specific gems you're missing. You always know how many you've collected, but not where the missing ones are, which can lead to combing through entire levels multiple times just to track down that one stubborn gem. In keeping with the game's goal of being accessible to all ages, Spyro's difficulty doesn't really come from reaching the end of a level or defeating enemies, it comes from hitting 100%. Finishing stages is usually pretty easy. It's finding every last gem and collectible that tests the player. With only 2 attacks available at any given time, combat isn't especially deep unless it's paired with environmental interaction. The most dynamic it ever feels is in the handful of moments where side rolls can be used to dodge incoming enemies. Even the bosses barely register as bosses. As a kid, I don't think I ever really clocked that they were bosses. Their levels still have gems to collect and dragons to rescue like any other stage. The only difference is there's some weird asshole waiting at the end. Most of them are pushovers, all of them are optional, and even the final encounter with Nasty is less of a fight and more of a chase. That said, the difficulty does ramp up in a genuinely satisfying way once you reach the Beastmaker's realm, and not just in terms of combat and hazards, but in how demanding the collecting becomes. Sure, levels like Misty Bog are packed with dangerous enemies like those stupid frogs, but ask anyone who grew up with Spyro and they'll tell you the most infamous level in the game is Treetops. The main path through Treetops is short and straightforward, but 100%ing it is a whole different story. The level is an intricate web of massive tree stumps and supercharge ramps, all of which must be used and reused in very specific ways to reach its furthest areas. You'll need to change supercharges into other supercharges, sometimes running backwards up ramps instead of down them, combining that momentum with perfectly timed jumps and glides. At one point, you end up sprinting and leaping across nearly the entire level in a matter of seconds. As a kid, I was completely stuck on Treetops for days. But when that eureka moment finally hit, it became one of the most satisfying accomplishments of my entire childhood. This is what gaming is all about, fellas. And for a late 90s 3D platformer, the controls are, all things considered, remarkably smooth. One of Insomniac's biggest takeaways from Super Mario 64 was the importance of a protagonist who is simply fun to control. And while Spyro lacks Mario's depth, precision, and room for experimentation, I'd say they largely succeeded. Rarely does it feel like Spyro isn't responding the way I want him to. By modern standards, this camera is a little too slow and Spyro's turns are a little too wide, but compared to how rough many of its contemporaries handled 3D controls, Spyro set something of a standard. Insomniac even brought in a former NASA engineer to help fine-tune the controls, particularly the gliding and flying mechanics, and it shows most clearly in the bonus flight levels. Each flight level gives Spyro full aerial freedom and tasks you with completing a series of objectives, flying through hoops, destroying chests, defeating enemies, all within a strict time limit and without touching the water below. These time trials are some of the most exhilarating moments in the game. Even though there is an intended route through each one, it's often possible to shave off precious seconds by breaking the expected order and finding more efficient paths. The developers themselves have admitted they became briefly addicted to replaying these stages, and yeah, I get it. But it's also worth emphasizing that Spyro the Dragon was a genuine technical achievement for its time. For one thing, the load times are impressively short given the sheer size of its levels. Loading is noticeable, but never unreasonably long. More importantly though, the game's engine itself was quietly revolutionary. In the early days of 3D, most consoles, PlayStation included, simply didn't have enough RAM to render massive environments all at once. Developers worked around this limitation in a few familiar ways: narrow fields of view, pre-rendered 2D backgrounds, or thick persistent fog meant to hide polygon pop-in. Even Insomniac's own Disruptor leaned heavily on fog to mask its graphical limits. With Spyro, though, the team took a different approach. Programmer Alex Hastings developed a 3D panoramic engine that allowed large portions of a level to be rendered at extreme distances without tanking performance or frame rate. Essentially, two versions of the environment exist at once: a high detail version near the player, and a low detail version in the distance that shows only basic shapes and colors, without textures or shading. As Spyro moves through the world, those distant objects gradually fill in with detail. This approach dramatically reduced strain on the PlayStation's limited RAM, while still allowing players to see nearly endless horizons in every direction, a defining part of Spyro's sense of scale. As a clever bonus, gems emit a simple glint effect that's visible from any distance, making it easy to spot unexplored areas and reinforcing the game's emphasis on open-ended exploration. Spyro the Dragon was one of the first games to use this engine, and it became a cornerstone of the series' visual identity. Presentation-wise, Spyro largely sticks the landing. Animations are smooth, frame rate dips are rare, and the worlds are colorful, vibrant, and visually distinct. Levels are full of small interactive touches, like tall grass and shrubs you can torch. However, where the hardware limits show most clearly is in the enemies. Spyro and the Elder Dragons are fairly detailed, but many enemies feel noticeably abstract, their designs simplified and polygon counts reduced to the point of looking like vague, misshapen blobs, and this doesn't seem entirely intentional. But I suppose performance had to be prioritized somewhere, and the enemies clearly took the hit. Thankfully, they're animated with enough personality that it rarely detracts from the experience. I may not always know what I'm fighting, but damn it, they're still charming as all hell. The music, though, is excellent across the board. Universal brought in Stuart Copeland, drummer for The Police, who turned film composer after the band broke up in 1986, and Spyro was one of his earliest forays into video games. His distinctive synth-heavy style gives the game a unique energy that still stands out today. Copeland was provided with early builds of each level to play through for inspiration, writing roughly 3 tracks per day and refining them the following day. Each level ended up with its own unique piece of music, resulting in dozens of tracks across the game. Copeland would go on to score several Spyro sequels, and has since looked back on the series as some of his favorite work. And in a fun bit of trivia, he later reused the Wizard Peak theme as the end credit music for Nickelodeon's The Amanda Show. I'm sure my fellow millennials remember that show. Voice acting is another area where the game benefits from Universal's involvement. The cast includes experienced performers like Clancy Brown and Michael Gough, while Spyro himself is voiced by Carlos Alazraqui, best known, depending on your age, as Rocco from Rocco's Modern Life, or the Taco Bell Chihuahua, I guess. Alazraqui only voices Spyro in this first game, and I can kinda see why. His take leans a bit too hard into snark, if you ask me, and often sounds more like a hippie surfer dude. No disrespect to the actor, of course, I just don't think the role was a perfect fit. The writing doesn't do him any favors, either. There is at least one clever lore implication. By the time you reach Nasty's world, the dragons you rescue are ones you've already freed before, implying they tried and failed to confront him. But overall, the game's story barely qualifies as one, and the dialogue largely feels like fluff. Every rescue dragon has something to say, sometimes a simple thank you, but other times ranging from gameplay tips to jokey banter, and it's all very standard 90s kids cartoon humor. Occasionally it lands, more often it earns a groan. The writers especially loved one recurring gag where some elderly dragon will start a long-winded story, only for Spyro to cut him off and dip out. Yes, we get it, old people talk a lot. Did we really need that joke 4 times? Still, the exaggerated cartoon aesthetic and traditional voice acting give Spyro the Dragon the feel of an interactive animated TV show. But crucially, not in the shallow or derivative way that Crash sometimes did. Unlike Crash, Spyro actually speaks, giving him a defined personality throughout the whole game. He can feel a little Sonic-coded at times, but here it doesn't come off as cheap. Spyro's creator, Craig Stitt, previously worked as a level artist on Sonic 2, and knowing that, the shared DNA feels more like lineage than imitation. When Spyro the Dragon released in September 1998, sales were initially slow, but strong reviews and word of mouth quickly carried it through the holiday season. Critics were enthusiastic, frequently calling it the best 3D platformer the PlayStation had seen up to that point, and often comparing it to Banjo-Kazooie, a rival N64 collectathon that released the same year. The game earned 3 award nominations, including Game of the Year, though it didn't win any of them. Spyro lost 2 categories to Banjo-Kazooie, and lost Game of the Year to Ocarina of Time. Which is fair, because it's f***ing Ocarina of Time. If there was one flaw reviewers consistently pointed out, it was the camera. Hardly surprising for any early 3D platformer. The camera generally tries to stay behind Spyro, and while you can manually adjust it with the shoulder buttons, it only rotates left or right. In tighter spaces, this means it can snag on walls, floors, or ceilings, and while the game offers 2 camera presets to control how aggressively it auto-adjusts, neither feels ideal. It's far from the worst 3D camera I've ever seen, and I'd argue it's at least more cooperative than Mario 64's most of the time, but it is responsible for a few unnecessary headaches. Still, the rest of the game was strong enough to make Spyro one of the PlayStation's most popular titles, launching a franchise that, alongside Crash, helped carry the console through the late 90s. The two quickly became companion series, beginning a tradition where each new entry in both franchises would feature a secret playable demo of the other, a very specific kind of cross-promotion that felt magical at the time. The Spyro games were some of my personal favorites growing up, and I replayed them constantly, so much so that my original disc is worn to absolute hell. The music skips almost non-stop. It's the same disc I've owned for 25 years, and boy does it show. While prepping for this video, I picked up a digital copy on PS3 to avoid that problem, only to discover that the PSN versions are kinda notorious. Due to how uniquely these games utilize the PS1's hardware, the PS3's emulator doesn't handle them particularly well. I noticed frame rate drops almost immediately, and the controls felt all kinds of off. In the end, I went back to my beat-up old physical copy, deciding that the music skipping was preferable to the entire game feeling wrong. So, long story short, if you're planning to play the original Spyro trilogy today, you're better off with the Reignited trilogy, or tracking down an actual PS1 disc. They're still pretty cheap. After all, they printed like a bajillion of these things. Looking back, Spyro the Dragon feels like a franchise that could only have existed in that exact moment in time. Outside of the original PlayStation trilogy, the series never quite recaptured that same spark, and some later entries were, frankly, very bad. Spyro became a relic of a very specific era of game design, one we probably won't ever see fully return. But that doesn't diminish what the original game accomplished. Strip away the era-specific quirks, the dated jokes, and the technical limitations, and what's left is a platformer built on strong fundamentals, intuitive controls, thoughtful level design, and a genuine sense of discovery. Those things don't age. Spyro didn't reinvent the genre the way Mario 64 did, but it didn't need to. What it did instead was prove that the PlayStation could stand shoulder to shoulder with Nintendo in the platforming space. Not by copying Mario outright, but by understanding what made that new 3D design philosophy work. And honestly, for a brief moment in the late 90s, that little purple dragon felt just as essential to the PlayStation as Mario did to Nintendo. And that's no small accomplishment.